that sails her eyes, by the catch the fish and take them home to Liza. Hip you pard the solid taboo, hip you pard the solid brown, Poga, Quilligan, Morton, Hammer, all around the circle. Suds and rice and crummy and face, cake and tea for supper, catfish in the spring of the year for raid and maggoty butcher. Hip you pard the solid taboo, hip you pard the solid brown, Poga, Quilligan, Morton, Hammer, all around the circle. I don't want your maggoty fish, that's no good for winter. I can buy as good as that down in Bonavista. Hip you pard the solid taboo, hip you pard the solid brown, Poga, Quilligan, Morton, Hammer, all around the circle. Here we go, Billy boy.
Hello, Canada and hockey fans in the United States and Newfoundland.
My delegation would like to submit to the Assembly a very short resolution.
I'm delivering the Mackenzie King Lecture on the role of seances and maternal fixations in governmental decision-making.
The per capita export value of our manufactured products is greater than that of any other country, with the exception of Great Britain.
For, of course, this post-national trend is a worldwide one, and if Canada works out its present crisis successfully, it could serve as a pilot project for an emerging new mode of human life.
That's why my message is one not of despair, but of hope for the future.
But if the climate should change, if we should become anything like a police state in any shape or form, violence could become justified.
But listen, you kid, don't get caught in the Canadian syndrome, where if it's Canadian, it's got to be bad.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Red Ensign Live. This is my usual weekend community stream, unfortunately delayed from the weekend due to, it's been a busy week for those of us who have work in the financial markets, let's put it that way. But here it is, a couple of days delayed. I've got a pretty hefty mailbag, lots of stuff people want me to address. I may have one of my usual co-hosts come and join, but it's a pretty big ask to get people to come and join during the day, during the week. So we'll just have to see whether that comes to pass. A couple of topics here off the top. First of all, a developing story in Toronto. Apparently, two gunmen drove up University Avenue in Toronto, got out of a car and unloaded the contents of their handguns in the general direction of the U.S. Embassy. The U.S. Embassy in Toronto is a heavily fortified building. If you've ever been to it, it's got it's intended to sustain car bombs of substantial size. So it's highly unlikely that the attack was even noticed by the people inside the embassy, but hopefully nobody was, hopefully there were no bystanders or whatever. Pretty obviously a symbolic gesture rather than, it's either a symbolic gesture or these people are just like complete buffoons, because it's pretty obvious that you're not going to achieve anything in this respect. But it does show the degree of sentiment that exists out there, particularly, we don't know who these people are, but I think it would not be difficult to guess that they're members of the Islamic community who are unhappy about the present conduct of our neighbors south of the border. There's a lot of issues that come together in an event like this. This is the consequence of mass migration. This is the consequence of poor policing. And this is the consequence of the aggressive international behavior of our friends in the United States, who, like Canada, have a country full of Iranian nationals and people from the Islamic world more broadly, who are going to view this set of actions as a provocation, and they're going to view the fatwa issued by the powers that be inside Shia Islam as binding upon them. If we needed more reason to end the project of mass migration. This is a good reason. If we needed more reason to end the pattern of lawn mowing operations in the Middle East in favor of the regional hegemony of the State of Israel, this is another excellent reason for doing that. But we'll see how the story develops and who the culprit is ultimately identified to be. Speaking of the conflict in the Middle East, we see now that the conflict has settled into a difficult kind of pattern. That pattern is kind of as follows. The Iranians have successfully shut down shipping traffic through the Straits of Hormuz to all traffic which doesn't meet their demands. And their demands are to expel American and Israeli military assets from the region. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to use the closure of the straits, the strikes on American military installations, and the limited strikes on oil and gas infrastructure to coerce the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, etc., to expel the Americans, to expel any Israeli assets that are in the region. And they've got this enormous hammer in this very difficult to break blockade of the straits in their hand. They continue to exchange missile fire with Israel, missile and drone fire with Israel, who continues, Israel and the United States, for their part, continue to aggressively strike anything that they think that they can hit in Iran in order to try to degrade the capability of the Iranian regime to fire missiles. To score the conflict at this point is kind of difficult. It's clear that both sides have gotten hits. So it is clear that the Americans have used their air power. The Americans and the Israelis have used their air power to hit significant targets inside Iran. How serious the damage is not clear, but they very obviously still have a substantial ballistic missile and drone capability that extends around the region. Equally, it's clear that the Iranians have been able to score hits both on the Gulf states and in Israel. The extent of the damage is not entirely clear, though the extent of the damage to the oil and gas infrastructure is obviously significant. The other important point here is that the Iranians can, with very, very limited equipment, sustain a blockade over the Straits of Hormuz basically indefinitely. And if that blockade can be broken by military escort through military vehicles containing anti-drone equipment, etc., that's yet to be demonstrated by any power in modern warfare. So that'll be a very interesting test of strength if the French go through with their promise to try to force open the straits through naval action. Yet to be seen exactly how that will go. Though, in the meantime, the blockage of production is beginning to cascade through the international market. There were big waves over the weekend and then on Monday, and then again in the opposite direction today, as the market tries to feel out what the supply situation actually is. There's a lot of chatter on Monday about the big market reversal from taking the market for WTI from 120 back down to 80, and then it's when I last looked, it was headed back up today. These kinds of wild market swings are typical of a market trying to price in very difficult to assess blockages in production political actions. Those wild swings are reflecting uncertainty in the market, and they're reflecting a market where there's a lot of non-public information in. So yesterday, I think it was about 3 o'clock, President Trump came out and made a speech that indicated, at least to some extent, that he was thinking of de-escalating the conflict. but the swing to the downside in the oil market preceded the speech by several hours, which means that it's almost certainly the case that significant players in the oil market knew that direction was going to be taken long in advance of Trump's particular speech. And then we see the opposite direction being pursued here. There's some basic kind of, the oil market is different than equity markets in that there are the insider trading rules that exist for the equity markets are much more difficult to enforce because people make significant buy and sell actions in the oil futures market as part of their normal course business operations. And these pattern of business market actions can easily be disguised as speculative trades in a market where people that are actually engaged in the business have significant non-public information. So you should, as a member of the public, you should know that you're at an information disadvantage when attempting to trade on an event like this. None of that is financial advice, just a caution about the realities of a situation like this. There's a comment in here: was the market reversal real, or is it just oil futures? So the thing about oil futures is that most of them are physical delivery. So you can see like wild trading swings based on speculation during the day, but those wild trading swings cannot persist very long because at the end of the day, there's a limited list of sellers of oil futures because you have to actually deliver, and there's a limited list of buyers of oil futures just because you actually have to receive delivery. And so there's a clock on all the kind of derivatives nonsense that you see in a market like the oil market, and it is utterly dominated by people who are actually in the business of oil rather than traders in terms of its long-term price action. That's why you see stuff like negative oil prices during COVID. That's why you're seeing price shocks right now. And it's also why you see after hours trading, like what you saw on Sunday, often not reflect what realities are when the market opens, because most of the major players conduct business during business hours in basically not on Sundays, during business hours for things like the CME and the London Metals Exchange. So that's kind of the state of play in that particular comment. I wanted to address at length one viewer question that pertains pretty closely to the situation, and that is, so we've seen that one of the key war goals of the Iranians in this conflict is to force the Gulf states out of their partnership with the United States and Israel. And the consequence of forcing the Gulf states out of that partnership would be to break a system that is widely known as the petrodollar, right? For those who don't know, the petrodollar is a description of a system that is built on agreements that date back to the 70s and 80s, whereby the oil producing states in the Gulf will sell oil exclusively in US dollars, and they will take substantial portions of their oil revenues and reinvest them in United States Treasury bills. It's part of the way in which the US dollar established itself as the global reserve currency, and it's part of the way in which the US government is able to run perpetual fiscal and trade deficits. In other words, export dollars in exchange for physical goods of various kinds, and export its inflation at the same time. It's worth noting that the petrodollar system is a weak description for the system as it exists at this point. The system is built on two fundamental realities. First, that there's artificial demand for U.S. Treasury bills across the world. Second, that there's demand for U.S. dollars to conduct transactions. So the first leg of that system to look at is to look at treasuries who holds them in foreign reserves. And interestingly, in the current state of things, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, these are not among the largest holders of U.S. treasuries. Even if you include the Cayman Islands, which is often a vehicle for wealth um, associated with these states as a kind of gateway to the U.S. Treasury market, among other markets, you're still looking at a substantial minority of the Treasury market, uh, very small minority actually. And so the elimination of this part of the system will not collapse the system by itself. So you could have a situation where the petrodollar system, from a treasury's point of view, ceases to exist completely, and the U.S. dollar persists as the reserve currency, and you see status quo continue broadly from an economic point of view. However, that's not a complete story. There's still two other legs of the system that are worth noting here. One leg is the non-treasury sovereign wealth system. The other leg is the transactional system. The non-treasury sovereign wealth system is interesting. So the region has 5 of the maybe 10 largest sovereign wealth funds in the world for Abu Dhabi, Kuwait, Dubai, Riyadh, and Doha. If you look at what these sovereign wealth funds actually invest in, they invest primarily not in U.S. treasuries, right? So U.S. treasuries actually represent a minority of the spending of Gulf state treasury bills at this point. In fact, they represent less of the Gulf states spending on assets, spending of their resource revenues than, for example, private equity, or about the same as real estate. S&P 500 equities, like European developed market equities, are actually the biggest single allocation for these sovereign wealth funds. But significantly, in the real estate market, in the private equity market, in the private debt market, so this credit market, that's the private debt market, infrastructure, this is all of the kind of lending and investment to Western governments directly in their projects for public-private partnerships. There are very, very large allocations to all of these other areas. So all of these other asset classes that over the last couple of decades have inflated substantially in value are all potentially under threat as a result of a break in the relationship between the United States and the Gulf states. Equally, the Gulf states have literally hundreds of billions of reasons not to break that relationship, right? So if the relationship between the U.S. and the Gulf states breaks, what happens to the 1.6 trillion in the Abu Dhabi sovereign wealth fund? Does it all get repaid? Maybe not, but certainly that relationship transforms in a reality where Iran gets its way in this war. So that's worth noting. The third leg of this is the transactional leg. So there is some demand for U.S. dollars created by the fact that the futures market clears in U.S. dollars. It is extremely difficult to figure out exactly how large that demand is, and whether or not, in a situation where the diplomatic alignment of the Gulf states changes from the United States to either a neutral or pro-China alignment, whether any significant portion of the market actually leaves U.S. dollars from a futures trading point of view. I think the answer to that is probably not immediately. None or not very much leaves the U.S. dollar ecosystem. And so I think it's what you're looking at here is a threat by degree over time, not a direct threat to the system. So even if Iran succeeds in its war goals, or if the war drags on and there's a blockade, you're not going to see a threat to the US dollar system emerge catastrophically and quickly. What you're going to see is an increasing pace of erosion in the erosion of that system. So you're looking at not a crisis, but something more slow moving, right? And we'll just kind of have to see how that plays out. Equally, I don't know. It's very hard to assess how effective the Iranians have been at forwarding this war goal, though they do seem to have the Gulf states by the throat with this very, very difficult to break blockade that they've enforced. I the number one kind of next item I'm trying to watch for in this war is whether or not a naval operation to open the straits can be successful. If a naval operation to open the straits can be successful, then we're looking at an entirely different conflict than I would assume. If it can't be done, then away we go. There's another question in the chat asking whether the Fed or the U.S. government is intentionally manipulating the oil markets. It's not. It's not clear at this point. So we'll have to either wait for public disclosures. We don't know whether the strategic reserves. So I did a video for Academic Agent on his channel reviewing the oil and gas market in advance of this crisis. One of the things I noted in it is that there are large strategic reserves of petroleum-related products in the U.S., in China, in Japan, in the Philippines, and in a number of other countries. Those reserves represent, depending on the country, between 100 and 300 days worth of supply. It's hard to know whether or not those reserves have begun to be tapped because in many cases, the governments involved will intentionally not tell you until long after the fact. We discussed the relative drawdown in advance of the conflict of the U.S. Strategic Reserve by the Biden administration in order to manage domestic discontent over inflation. So it's very hard as a member of the public to have complete information in this area. Again, you're at a huge disadvantage to the people who are professionally trading the oil and gas markets in this regard. Not financial advice, but just understand that there are hedge funds who are paying for satellite images of strategic reserves and tanker traffic and so on in order to see exactly how much is in these strategic reserves, see which ones are being tapped, why and where. And that is information which is not publicly available. And so, we as members of the public just kind of have to do our best and watch. All right, the last of the prepared topics that I wanted to address comes from a post I saw on Twitter, which is representative of a trend you see in these intellectual circles, at least to some degree. Post says something like 10 or 15 years ago, people on the far right, on the fringes of the discourse, had some crazy ideas that are now widespread and influential in real politics. What is the equivalent now? And that will kind of filter into conventional wisdom 15 years from now. Now, I responded to this idea because I think it is a serious mischaracterization of what has actually occurred. So I am one of these people who actually was there 10 or 15 years ago, reading and writing what the early neo-reactionaries, what the early kind of, what the early alternative right had to say. And this should not be taken as an endorsement of all of these ideas. I certainly don't agree with all of them in their totality. But this is a sense of what those ideas were at the time. So here are 10 of them that I could think of off the top of my head. IQ is hereditary and differs by ethnic group. Crime is a race problem rather than an education or training problem. Mass migration ruins everything in Western countries because of both 1 and 2. The civil rights Act needs to be repealed, again, connected to both 1 and 2. Hereditary absolute monarchy is good because it destroys the political illusion, right? So this goes back to the idea that the overwhelming majority of the population doesn't have any agency and doesn't form ideas based on facts. Instead, they live in this kind of propaganda bubble. So that's kind of one element of the argument for absolute monarchy, and then the other argument for it is that it aligns the incentives of the ruling class and the ruled together. Idea number 6: the collapse of religious belief in the West has led to a civilizational crisis. The people must be led by their elite into religious belief, otherwise civilization will crumble. Right? There's two ideas here. First, the idea that religion is a social necessity. People will adopt religion, and it will always be the religion that trickles down from the ruling class as the dominant religious force in society. Again, I don't necessarily agree with every one of these ideas, but these are the ideas that were circulating at the time. Idea number 7: men need to make more money than women for society to function, for the dating market to clear. And connected idea: fortunately, men deserve to make more money than women because of the occupations that they're willing to engage in. Okay. Idea number 8: women have a totally insane relationship with violence and therefore need to be restricted from political participation. These are the repeal the 19th Amendment people. These are the no women in politics people. Definitely a big thing in the 2008 to 2016 kind of window. Urbanization has a dysgenic effect because of IQ stripping to enter the urban elite class, and the way that urbanization negatively correlates to birth rates. This was written up as the idea of the IQ shredder by, I believe, Spandrel. Individualism is a propaganda mechanism is probably the wrong word. It is a propaganda campaign intended to politically target and politically cripple targeted populations. Right? These are a sense of the ideas that were actually circulating at the core of the far right in this period. None of these ideas have any purchase at all inside the gated institutional narrative today, though they have kind of marginal adoption among young people who are outside of the institutions. What is instead actually happened, the effect that posters like this are pretending is the popularization of these ideas, is instead the people inside the institutions saw arguments like this, saw that they were directly downstream of DEI and directly downstream of kind of woke narratives about history, and have attempted to tune down the emphasis, both rhetorically and in actuality, on DEI, right? The person who actually won this moment inside the elite class is somebody like Jordan Peterson and his argument from meritocracy. So when Buddy here talks about adoption of these edgy far right ideas, what he's actually talking about is a realization inside these gated institutional narratives that excluding all white men forever is a bad idea. He's not talking about actual adoption of any of these ideas, right? There is no legislation that exists anywhere in the Western world that argues that crime is a race problem, or that IQ is hereditary, or that it differs based on ethnic group, or that mass migration needs to end because of one of those two ideas. The Civil Rights Act has not been repealed or even substantially moderated by the Trump administration. There is almost no institutional power in the United States aimed at repealing the Civil Rights Act. If you took a vote of congressmen, you might find like 3 of them vote for repealing the Civil Rights Act. If you went to to the bureaucracy and in the United States and polled them on whether or not the Civil Rights Act should be repealed, you find a tiny percentage of them think that it should be repealed. If you go around staffers who tend to be younger on all the kind of Republican political campaigns, you'll find that a small percentage of them think the Civil Rights Act should be repealed. So no, we have not. The ideas that were fringe on the right wing have not been adopted by power. We're not in a governing position. We did not dictate the discourse. We've had significant adoption at the margins, particularly among the young, and particularly among those outside positions of institutional power. And we've had those inside the castle, inside positions of institutional power, realize that they need to do something and start to make noises towards increasing the degree of meritocracy to try to prevent a crisis in various societies. And we've had one other thing which is significant. We've had Bukele adopt the position that criminal justice that elements of traditional justice should be adopted, right? So I made a video fairly recently stating my position for criminal justice reform. Bukele has adopted a kind of watered down version of the criminal justice reforms that I have long called for and have long circulated on the online right. So there's like little bits of noise here, but what is going on in politics today is not the popularization of these ideas, and therefore they're kind of them being repeated in the stupidest possible form. What you're seeing is a realization from power that they need to do something about the exclusion of about a phenomenon called the base draft, the exclusion of highly intelligent young white men from positions of institutional power, and they're being set into positions of permanent opposition to power. And then, so there's a realization they need to do something about that, and then a popularization among, a couple of percent, maybe 8-9% of young men of these ideas as in their weakest formulations. So I just wanted to kind of come to this because, I see from guys like Dave Green this idea that the consequence of political success is that you hear your ideas repeated in their stupidest form. And I think that's actually true, but that's not what has happened. What has happened is altogether quite different. We have seen our ideas get some purchase in the broad public, and we've seen a realization from power that something needs to be done. But this is very different than the adoption of ideas circulating on the online right in the period between 2008 and 2016 in positions of real political power. It's a very different thing. All right. So I'm going to go from there to discussion of some of the questions from the audience. So just let me get up the mailbag here. Okay, so first question here relates to the war between Iran and the US/Israel. The question is, will Canadian support or lack thereof influence the relationship between Canada and the United States? I think that the extent to which Canada aligns with the United States on defense priorities is the most important factor in determining the future of its trade relationship with the United States. The gestures towards China that have been made by the Carney administration are a threat to that future relationship. A choice not to participate in the Iran war in a nominal respect. I mean, Canada, in the kind of war that's being waged right at the moment, There's nothing of significance that Canada can do to assist the United States. However, that may not be true depending on how the conflict evolves. And it certainly doesn't prevent Canada from providing nominal assistance to the United States. Aligning with the US on its security objectives, whatever they are, however stupid they are, is the correct strategy for the current Canadian order, because Canada will be able to maintain independence only insofar as it is seen as not a threat to the objectives of the American security state. So, the Canadian government should do its best to walk in lockstep with the American security state on these kinds of issues until steps have been taken to secure our sovereignty in a more direct way. Otherwise, it's going to be a big problem. The next question I've got here in the mailbag relates to this recent ruling in British Columbia that large sections of Vancouver belong by native title to one. I don't remember which Native American group that they've assigned them to, but there are. I mean, all the populated areas of BC are a patchwork of native land claims, and if this ruling is to be the first of many, basically every populated, the whole Fraser River Valley, the whole populated part of British Columbia is eventually going to be given as native title to one or another group. The first important point here is that native title is not the same as property ownership. It conveys to the band council rights that are comparable in many ways to a municipal government. So it gives them the right to deny planning permission to all kinds of things, and essentially creates a kind of bribery racket. The same way that declaring something an environmentally sensitive zone does. That has significant consequences if you're in real estate development in the region, or if you live in the region. It might matter to your property value. It's a way of the Laurentian elite paying off an important client group, though I would suggest that the Laurentian elite have substantially over-rewarded Native Americans as a client group at the expense of maximizing the value of their own tax annuity. And I think this is the Laurentian elite should, in their own interests, reign in the courts to some degree in this area. What does it actually mean? It's a kind of an ugly situation. I don't have the legal expertise to identify the precise consequences of each one of these claims, but it certainly is a pretty intense exercise in patronage. Hello, Brulaham. Welcome to the show.
Oh, how are you?
Not too bad. Thanks for making the effort to join. I usually do these community streams late at night on the weekends to try to make it accessible to people, but my weekend was pretty rough, so
Yeah.
here we are on a Tuesday afternoon.
Yeah, no worries. I was getting out of a meeting, and then I thought I'll just bring the dog to the dog park.
Yeah,
There's
well, there you go.
a reason. So I was catching up a little bit on the last commentary you made on the ideas that were perpetuated within the right-wing sphere, and I had a few things that I wanted to mention. Just I was curious to have your take on it. So one of them is I know you mentioned on one of the points, and I'm not saying this is your perspective, but just like in general in the space, the idea of like the issue of mass migration being tied to crime stats tied to race, and then IQ stats tied to race as well, or like ethnical backgrounds. So I just want to mention, I'm sure you agree, but I think another like major component of mass migration that's an issue is specifically having to do with the culture they're bringing in, friend-enemy distinction, and bringing foreign conflicts into your local polity. and
Yeah,
also like diminution of your traditions that essentially are getting like muddled by the traditions of other cultures, and kind of like a reduction in presentation of your traditions to your own population because you want to like help integrate the foreigners.
yeah. I mean, my opposition to mass migration is not along identical grounds to the opposition from the kind of online right between 2008 and maybe 2016. So if you look at the online right in
Yeah.
that period, their opposition to mass migration was primarily because it was not white, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, correct.
so their opposition was these people are going to come here, they're going to do crime, they're going to be a burden on our system, they're going to make our society worse, and they're going to do so because they're low IQ, low impulse control, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That was the
Right,
position that was expressed at the time. My
right.
opposition to mass migration actually has almost nothing to do with this, though. They have a point to some degree.
Well,
Um,
I think just to cut you off quickly. So I think because I think I'm in the same position as you are. Like if we had properly enforced like a justice system that properly enforced like rules and laws and traditions, the question of crime stats tied to race and those types of issues, you could easily call by just having like severe punishment. And in my opinion, you should have even more severe punishment for foreigners and recent migrants than for local populations. Um,
yeah, there's
so yeah,
certainly you could ameliorate a lot of those issues just by having a justice system that actually works. Um,
correct.
but my actual objection to mass migration is a moral objection on the basis of inheritance. I think that we have a duty as a people to pass to our descendants what our forefathers passed to us. That means tradition, that means land, that means culture, that means everything that makes up a people. And so, mass migration is a break in that intergenerational contract that is the society as a whole. And so, it doesn't matter to me if that mass migration is from France or if that mass migration, or maybe France is a bad example because of the historical ties between French Canadians. If that migration is from Poland or if that migration is from Uganda, one is going to be more difficult to live with than the other. But in my opinion, both are breaches of this profound moral duty that we have as a society. Um,
Yeah.
that's not to say that there is no substance to the position being represented in the period between '08 and 16. There is substance to it, but that's not actually the primary reason why I object to mass migration.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree. And I know you mentioned France. Like I'm French Canadian, so
Yeah,
obviously there's some ties there. But I do agree with you because, like, essentially, if you look at within Quebec, if you look at cities where there's more French migration, that's more recent. And I even mean like proper French as understood,
yeah,
not like foreigners in France. Um, Even those guys create like small enclaves. In Montreal, you have the Plateau, which is like always joked as being Little France. Um, and
yeah.
you do see a difference in culture, and they also have their history from the like post-revolutionary period, and like their culture and the way they think about things is very different to French Canadians.
Well, I
You'd have
think
to
at
go to
the
very specific. Sorry,
I
go
think
ahead.
at
Go
this
ahead.
point it's pretty fair to call French Canadians a distinct people from the French,
Yeah, yeah, of
in
course.
a whole number of ways. So,
Yeah, yeah,
in that
exactly.
regard, I think France, like mass migration from France to French Canada, I think would damage their culture. I think.
Yeah, and then another thing I heard you talk about regarding like Dave Green's position about well, not just Dave Green's, but I know quite a few people on the right have this idea that what is called slub is like kind of like a mass popularization of right wing ideas, and that you're bound to get this when masses are confronted with those ideas, that you get like a kind of dilution. So I think this is like self-evidently true in the sense that like any idea that gets popularized will get some form of dilution and simplification for the sake of the mythos of the idea, and like the tradition making. You need to have something that's like easy to understand no matter your background and your intelligence and things like this. But I think a component that's missing when people like refer to SLUP is that SLUP isn't just like a slight dumbing down of those ideas. I think that would be just, like popularization. I think SLUP is people are taking these ideas and specifically injecting some political formula to it to kind of like wedge it into specific issues to get a specific outcome. And as far as like the popularity goes with the mass population, I think also the issue is that a lot of those ideas are not built on a foundation of like a proper understanding of your ethnos and your traditions. So they're kind of like they're kind of like they're missing a component. Like I haven't thought through how to explain this, but essentially there's
if
like
I
a
might,
core component that's required before mass popularizations of those ideas that's missing.
if I might make a comment here, I think you're correct to identify much of what we call slop as propaganda linked to a political formula, right? Um, I've had some back and forth with some people that would people who watch the stream might be familiar with about the endless stream of what I would call demoralization videos coming out of Canada, right?
Right.
So these are uh, there's like an endless number of issues. Like you could log on to Twitter every morning and you could find 10 posts, videos, news clips, whatever, of something terrible that's happened in Canada that's linked to one of these ideas that has been circulated, right? Typically, these are linked to mass migration right at the moment, but you also see them linked to kind of uh, female coded managerialism is a very popular genre of these videos. But there are, and they go on and on. Um, what do I think about this set of artifacts? Well, I think uh, they're being presented to you as part of a program to delegitimize the political formula of the current elite. And there's good that is a complicated. I think there's value in that, but the value in that is limited by the extent to which you have some alternate political force with which to replace it. And right at the moment, the only force that exists politically within Canada capable of replacing the Laurentian elite is either the Western elite or the Americans. And neither of those two forces are particularly desirable to govern the country at the moment. And so when you're dealing with this kind of endless flow of incident reporting, you need to understand that it's being presented with the agenda of forwarding the interests of one of these two groups, typically.
Correct. And the Iron War has been extremely illuminating for many in this regards. I mean, the Zionist faction in Canada doesn't have much purchase, but you can clearly see they have enormous purchase in the Western coalition. Like they're essentially the only component of the political class that's gung ho on this war.
Yeah, and you can see why they would have like the Western elite have been historically a lot more aligned with the defense industrial complex in the United States, and you can see how their interests are aligned. Just like the Western elite got rich during the Iraq War as a consequence of the missteps of the military industrial complex in the U.S. If the U.S. ends up in like a 5-year quagmire trying to occupy Iran somehow, that will serve to massively enrich Western Canada. And so,
correct.
If I had less of a soul and was a holder of a few more Western Canadian oil stocks, maybe I too would be using my influence footprint to root for a permanent blockade of the Straits of Hormuz.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it makes the Western oil fields viable, essentially.
Well, I mean, one of the
they're
things
already
that's
viable,
interesting.
but it makes them extremely profitable.
Well, one of the things that's interesting about the price disruptions that come from an event like this is because their telegraphed is not permanent. people don't invest in new oil production on the basis of the price increases. So the increase in price just gets captured in profit by the unaffected producers. So if you're a producer anywhere else in the world that is unaffected by these disruptions, every dollar increase in the price of oil just flows straight to your bottom line, if and until there's evidence that this is going to be a permanent disruption, at which point people will start investing in alternate capacity.
Yeah, correct. And,
So,
and I mean, this is like a quality of the Trump administration. I mean, every single of his moves has been this chaotic, like, impermanence of programs. Like the tariffs are a perfect example of this. Like, there's been like no extra investment made in the US and in the West, to be sure, because it's been so chaotic. People don't trust that.
I've covered this extensively on Radlib's channel. There's been almost no increase in industrial production inside the US as a consequence of the tariffs. And I highly suspect that this has to do with the fact that the tariffs change every week and there's no sense of political permanence behind them.
Correct.
So, were there any other thoughts that you had about the events of the last 10 days that you think we should discuss with this audience? Or
So I missed part of your commentary on the war in Iran, so I forgive me if that's been covered. But in my opinion, I think it's important to try to be relatively clear on what we think, and like either outcome means. So in my opinion, at this point, if there's a wind down of the war, and essentially Iran agrees to a ceasefire within a few days or within a week or two, and there's no like major terms given to Iran by the US, I think that means that they lost, essentially. The damage that's been done is just not enough. Like, no matter the extent of the damage, the time and the damage that's been done is not enough for Israel and the US to take this as a, like, we'll never do this again type situation, or we won't do this for a decade or two.
I would say that the war aims of the Iranians are to drive the U.S. out of particularly the Gulf states, but broadly out of the region. And then the war aims of Israel, the U.S., are a grass-cutting operation to degrade the capacity of Iran to fight future wars. And it's certainly the case that the U.S. has done significant damage to Iran in degrading its capability to fight future wars. Exactly how much is kind of hard to say, but it is not at all clear the extent to which Iran has permanently driven the U.S. out of its influence footprint in the Gulf states. And to me, the question that is really interesting now are the questions that are really interesting now are: A, can the Straits of Hormuz be opened by force? And B, can the Iranians? I mean, I think we can see at this point that the Iranians can sustain coherence under this bombardment for quite a while, at least sufficient coherence to keep the blockade of the Straits up, and sufficient coherence to keep the threat of bombardment up. If that's the case, how long can they keep together politically, domestically, to keep up the blockade? Because I don't see, if the blockade can't be ended by force without a significant military occupation, I think it's very likely that there are concessions to the Iranian war aims of forcing the U.S. out of the region.
Yeah, and I think some other important things to keep in mind is, like, I think that people, people that are pushing for the war in the US and in the West, they make claims that the toppling of many of the top of the regime in Iran is extremely, like, is causing chaos and is causing a high likelihood of a collapse of their regime in the near future, and they might claim this as a victory. And I think this is correct if this conflict ends relatively soon, because there's a bunch of factions vying for power, and it's unclear, especially as an outside observer, how this change of governance, like this quick change of governance, will affect their future. And having this strategy of decentralized like control over military and force components of the state could lead to issues in their future. So I think there's like a bunch of
there's a
just
really
finish quickly.
Sure.
So just the last point I was going to make is I think there's a bunch of unobvious components where if the war keeps on going longer, it helps them see who within the state as like wants to push for mellowing of the conflict versus being more hardliner. It gives them time to gather data and insights about which part of the elite now is bought in, people bearing similar costs across the board. It kind of like helps them build foundations for the future of their regime.
Yeah, so there's a really important point here. The decentralized structure of the IRGC makes them candidates for civil conflict in the future. So the very thing that makes them resistant to decapitation makes them candidates for turning on one another at some point in the future. To this point in the conflict, they've proven remarkably resilient to efforts to do this. And I think in that regard, the choice to kill the Ayatollah on day one was a strategic error of significant proportions. But the Ayatollah's death won't last forever. Like you saw a similar effect where you saw a rally around the flag in Team Red after the death of Charlie Kirk. But it took, I mean, in the case of the death of Charlie Kirk, it took like maybe 24 hours on Twitter for the civil war within MAGA to reopen over the Zionism issue. And so the farther away you get from the events of the early war, the more difficult it will be for the IRGC to maintain cohesion as a decentralized structure. And I think part of the Israeli-American war strategy as they go on, if they can't open the straits by force, will be to try to incite civil war within the country. And
I think one of the things to keep in mind, and I think it's good to make parallels to our country, just to give people an idea. So if Canada was to be like attacked, bombed in a major conflict like this, and you saw major bombing of like Toronto and its the Greater Toronto area, and you didn't see as much damage out west and in Quebec and in the Maritimes, and then you had a wide swath of the elite killed and replaced in the short term, and you saw autonomous control of the different provinces to kind of act in their security interests to defend against this invasion and this bombing campaign, then obviously in the short term, if the conflict then ends suddenly, you could see like Western elites and Quebec elites and Maritimes leaders push to take over the control of the country, right? Because there's no political formula that was built between them amongst this chaos. And also, there was no fraternity built through suffering, right? Whereas if the conflict in Canada, in that case, like this fictitious conflict, lasted for months and months and years, and you saw like interprovincial help, aid, kind of like treating each other as brothers and fighting, elbow to elbow against this common enemy, that actually builds lasting ties. Like people actually feel like all of a sudden those groups that were not maybe as close to each other, suffered for each other.
That participation in common suffering and common struggle builds coherence, certainly.
Exactly. So I think this is important to keep in mind. And this is why I think if Iran pushes for an end of not pushes, but accept an end of the conflict with moderate terms to their benefit, I think it's actually means they failed, in my opinion. I think they need major concessions, or just a much longer conflict, like multiple months. Because otherwise, I think you're going to see major issues in the country in the next few years.
Yeah, they need to prove that it was for something.
Yeah.
And like an example of a sufficient um, a sufficient condition would be something like the removal of all U.S. military presence from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the Gulf states.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that this has follow-on effects. I think that the royalty-led states in the region are much, much weaker in regards to their population. I think they're organized currently and they have enormous power. So they're not really at risk of toppling like right now, but this risk is increasing tremendously over this conflict. So I think if American bases and American power is pulled from the region entirely, I think it's highly likely you'll see some of those like royal states fall essentially, and over the next few years. And I think that for Iran, it's a really, really big benefit to keep on striking Israel and the American assets, because this, like, it's kind of like the first time for Lebanon and Syria and Palestine and all of those other states that are quote unquote allied with Iran, that they see Iran do something for them in meaningful terms. So it really, really creates fraternity with those other states. You know, they always complain that they're never defended properly. This is like the first time they're showing they're doing so. So I think for them, there's like so many benefits.
There's a lot
as
of
far
incentive
as,
to keep the war
yeah.
going.
Yeah, which is why for me, I'm sure they're going to continue. If they don't, it means that in my head, I've miscalculated some elements, and I think it means that they lost. So this is what I'm very, very looking forward to see what's going to happen.
If they don't continue, I think it's very likely that what you're seeing. I don't even like my mental model here struggles to see how they would not continue, not just from an incentives point of view, but I pointed this out repeatedly to Americans on Twitter. I'm not sure that there's actually a person within the IRGC that has sufficient political legitimacy to to end the conflict on the IRGC side. Because if you imagine yourself as a member of that coalition who says, okay, we're going to cooperate with the Americans and the Israelis and end the strikes and de-escalate, immediately all of your peers are going to take the position that you're potentially an Israeli or American asset.
Correct.
Given what's happened in the country over the last couple of years. So I would be very surprised if it's even possible for the IRGC to make a favorable peace at this moment. I think the only way in which this conflict ends on their side is if there's something catastrophic, something that's gone catastrophically wrong within Iran that probably leads to civil war.
Yeah, or some collapse of the regime and just like very, very negative outcomes for the people, like the Persian people.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to get through some of the other mailbag questions here just before we call it a stream. There's a bunch of stuff on oil. On oil and the Iran conflict. I think we've covered that sufficiently. If you want my thoughts on the oil market specifically, you should go to that stream I put together for AA. Almost exactly the situation I laid out in advance of the conflict has actually played out. So you have all of the hard numbers there about what's happening.
Yeah. One comment, I don't even know if you mentioned this before, is it is wild to see the insider trading going on. Like, in like incredible transparency.
Yeah, it's I warned people during the stream that you're at a huge information disadvantage to a lot of people participating in that market. So it's not financial advice. Just understand what's going on. Another question here about the link between collapses in birth rates and the end of the family home-based production economy, the transition to the factory model in the 18th and 19th century. I think it's pretty clear that one of the aspects. How do I put this correctly? So, if you want to reinforce the family as an institution, what you have to do is make men, women, and children more mutually dependent upon one another. If you want to reinforce the community, make families more independent on each other. I made this comment on Twitter recently that you know, there are a lot of government policies relatively recently nominally aimed at increasing fertility that do things like pay for childcare and turn out to be completely counterproductive, because the very thing that actually strengthens families and therefore promotes childbearing is reinforcing the dependence of women on men. So the more that you pay for childcare, actually the more you undermine the thing that facilitates the creation of families. And the more that you
Agreed.
the more that you kind of try to nominally make having children less expensive, the worse position, the more you kind of undermine the interdependence that forms the family unit into something cohesive that sees a future for itself. The transition between the household as the primary economic unit and the factory as the primary economic unit was a major step in undermining the household as a central unit of society. And as a consequence of that, almost certainly played a role in the decline in fertility. This happened not only with regard to artisan production, but also as the family farm gave way to larger holdings, fencing, all of these kinds of social changes that undermined what I would call the natural organic unit in which men and women are incentivized to depend on one another, and therefore, I mean, the evolutionary psychologists, people would call it the evolutionary match for human psychology, right? People feel have the correct incentives and feel healthy and at home in situations where they're interdependent as a family and small community. And the more you undermine that, the more you create these perverse incentives and create these social conditions that lead to maladaptive behavior.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. The recent spate of the recent spate of interest between Carney and India. What's going on there? Oh my goodness, I don't actually know.
Yeah.
I've been trying to kind of understand from Carney's point of view what he thinks he's doing. I'm not sure why he's done what he's done there, and I'm waiting to see what comes out of it. So there's that. I want to put this into the same category as the new Bill C9, as things that we can't do anything about, and it's not clear exactly what the consequences of them will be. So
Yeah.
Bill C9 is the next round in escalation and censorship. It's predictable. I'm not sure exactly what the shape will be when it comes out, but there's absolutely nothing you or I can do that's going to stop this. And I think we just need to kind of observe and see if we can see where it fits into the broader patterns.
Yeah. For the thing about the rapprochement with India, so I agree with everything you said. The only thing I'll like mention, I guess, is I wonder, because this definitely goes against the pivot we've been discussing before, and
Yep.
it's been announced like right as the conflict with Iran began. So I wonder if this is something that was in the works for a little while, or I wonder if it's just like internal pressure from the Laurentian elite, and they're making those announcements like while the conflict begins to
Hide it.
like to hide it from the population, and at the same time give some red meat to the pressure they're getting internally. And if they're going to continue with the pivot, I'm assuming there's going to be later an announcement within a year or two that will kind of pull back some of those things, or like what it will look like will change, or there's going to be some like major investment announcements that are coming from India that are like red meat for people that are hoping for the pivot and things like this. I wonder how that's going to play out.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it's just a complete like nullification of the pivot and just yeah, I don't know. They're
Well,
just not learning from their mistakes, I guess.
well, the one thing I do want to point out here is that uh, the financial situation of the Laurentian elite is currently in flux because uh, depending on how the conflict in the Middle East plays out, you could see their runway for uh, their the reservoir of political support that they need to draw on might be a lot shallower than previously assumed, right? So if you think of the world as it stood the middle of February, the Laurentian elite needed to deepen their political support a lot because of the very negative economic prospects of the country going into the trade conflict with the United States. Uh, if we're in a world here over the next 6 months where oil is between $100 and $200 a barrel, uh, they're going to be able to buy a lot of political support, and they will need a lot. They will need to make a lot less social concessions.
Yeah.
So I think I mean, the Iran war could be a total disaster for anybody hoping for Canadian nationalism, because if the Laurentian elite can buy the political support that they would otherwise have had to acquire by taking cultural steps, then they may choose to go that route instead.
Yeah, if they're smart operators, there's a sense in which they probably should continue on the cultural steps, just because this is a dynamic that's been in a crescendo. Like they have to know that the economic situation and the dynamics within the nation are very bad for them. They're
Well,
too smart not to know.
I also think that the if they try to deal with the situation via giving economic concessions to the population, they're going to have to reckon with the Western elite in a way that they won't have to if they simply offer cultural concessions, because the a world in which oil is priced at $130 a barrel is a world in which the Western elite are a much more powerful force within Canadian politics,
Yeah.
and so just in order to keep their position within the dynamics of confederation, they're going to need to do their work in a way that they otherwise wouldn't. But that's an assumption that they're, sharp and careful operators, and they certainly, the Laurentian elite, have made their share of political errors in the past. So we'll have to see.
I wonder, just as a quick, it's something I just thought about, and I wonder if that's going to play into it. Okay, so we know there's been a ton of visas lapsing, specifically for South Asian communities, like
Yep.
tying into educational systems and things like this. And we know that a lot of them have repatriated or moved elsewhere, but there's still a lot of them that are just still on the territory with lapsed visas.
Yep.
And so if we think of this move, like let's assume the pivot is continuing, right? And we also know that the CPC is eager for more immigration, and I mean, they're taking photos with Sikhs and Indians all the time.
Yeah.
So we know they're pushing for this for their economic partners in the West. So I wonder if this isn't like actually they're making some investments, getting investments back from India, and they're not necessarily gonna like actually bring in more people. They'll just like give visas to people that are still staying to pad those
Yeah.
numbers.
Yeah,
And
I'm
then
not sure what they're gonna do.
no, me
We're
neither. But I'm thinking like let's say this is happening, right? Like so now like they don't really have a means to get those people out of the country. So now they're getting concessions from their like internal pressures. They're getting concessions from the Western elite in regards to economic development. And then nothing really changes with the state of the country as far as population goes. And then they can just pull back on those visas and things like this within a few years if things are still going in a direction where they need to keep going with the pivot. Like that could be a play.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things in flux. I also think that, a couple of press conferences in India are not the same as making substantive changes to the country, and so we
Yeah.
should wait and see what they actually do.
Yeah.
I said this recently to AA in an exchange, and I said, well, what evidence do you have for this besides the things that they say? And he kind of laughed at it because it's kind of a weird thing. Things that they say are important evidence, but I tend to favor an approach that looks at the substantive actions of elite groups rather than their public statements, because statements lie, actions don't lie. In
Yeah,
a lot of
perfect.
cases. So, anyways, I've gotten to the end of my list of community questions. I'm going to have a look at the chat here and see if there's anything worth addressing. Is there anything else you want to talk about Canadian politics before we kind of wrap up?
No, because I have to go actually soon. So for me, if there's like one or two questions, and then we can close out.
Yeah, I mean, the last question here is about C9, and is C9 getting rammed through? Almost certainly, yes. You're in a government where it's kind of uncertain whether they're going to head to an election soon, but they certainly have support on both the on both sides of the aisle, the CPC and the LPC, to ram through C9. So you'll probably see some performative whining about how free speech is an important Canadian value, and then you'll see the next round of censorship bills go through without incident. So
Yeah.
that's it. Oh, right. The last question I was going to answer is on the money laundering operations in Canada. So it's pretty clear, given the scale of the operations, given the involvement of TD. There's a huge finding on money laundering for TD's U.S. unit in 2024, I believe, and given the CSIS report in 2023 implicating many members of the Canadian government, that there's a significant relationship between this architecture and political power within Canada. It's pretty obvious, given the dynamics of Canada in the 2000s and 2010s, why this has occurred. Right, this problem is a function of the failed attempt to absorb China into the American empire in the 2000s and 2010s, a failed attempt that the Canadian elite were major sponsors of. And the legacy of it is this this situation in Canada that I don't think anybody really knows quite how to deal with. The Americans, if they were more competent, would be able to force it out of Canadian politics. But my view is that the Americans are not very competent at manipulating the politics of their vassal states right at the moment. And so I expect this to persist for some time. To be honest, I'm not actually sure what political changes would have to take place in order to actually break it.
Yeah, I'll agree with you there. I don't see how they can make this change.
I mean, if you had a more competent American government, they could use the trade relationship to force. So, a competent Canadian government would wake up tomorrow morning, arrest everybody named in the CSIS report, and tear out these rings root and branch in order to align Canada with the current position of the U.S. security state. But there's nobody within Canadian politics right at the moment that has the correct set of incentives and power in order to do that. And there's nobody on the American side. Like, if you actually look at what the Americans have said at the negotiating table in regard to trade, it's all these little petty issues around what I would call dollars and cents issues. They have not, neither side of that negotiation has seen fit to actually address the real security issues that are driving the conflict. And as a consequence, you might see some temporary relief in the negotiations at various points, but because the underlying security issues, the underlying conflict is not even under discussion, you're in this kind of ridiculous situation where nothing is going to be resolved. It's a tragedy of lack of political leadership on both sides.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, thanks for joining. I really appreciate joining a community stream at 3:00 on a Tuesday. I will endeavor to restore this community stream to its proper position on the weekend in the coming weeks. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for your time and attention.
Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be American.
The line just popped into my head. A bunch of the boys was a-whooping it up. And there I got my start.
We have had a flag. Flags can be changed. But flags cannot be imposed, the sacred symbols of a people's hopes and aspirations, by the simple, capricious, personal choice of a Prime Minister of Canada.
I have watched this country for half of my life from abroad, and we have turned complacency into just that, a national sport.
I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening. I don't choose just to sit and let the juggernaut roll over me.